Today we are talking about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. This text, this source, is derived from a speech that Wilson addressed to the United States Congress on January 8, 1918, at the end of the devastating Great War, now of course known as the First World War. The US had entered the war relatively late in April 1917. Woodrow Wilson was in his second term as US President at that time, and he was trying to stay neutral in the conflict, even mounting a peace offensive in December 1916 and offering a mediating role between the battling forces. But the Germans unleashed their submarines at American ships anyway, which left Wilson with no choice to declare war and side with the Entente powers. The addition of American military resources and money to these Allied forces tipped the scale against the Germans, who laid down their weapons in late 1918. Months earlier, Wilson had already presented his 14 points to Congress as a proposal for peace negotiations, and to establish a League of Nations to prevent future wars. His main goal was the establishment of collective security through global diplomacy. It is important to note, however, that these points were solely made from his personal, quite liberal point of view. The other Allied forces had very different ideas of what the outcome of this war should be. For example, Wilson wanted absolute freedom of navigation of the seas, which Britain was not a fan of, and France wanted Germany to pay in a far harsher way than Wilson thought was necessary. Eventually, Wilson spent months at the Paris Peace Conference to personally negotiate with his allies. When the Treaty of Versailles was formed, he had to compromise on many of his 14 points, but more about this later. Most importantly, his idea of the League of Nations was made into reality. It may have been a short-lived international organization, but it formed the blueprint of the United Nations that we know today.
To understand Wilson's 14 points a little bit better, it's necessary to put these points in a historical context and examine the results of the war and the approaches of the societies to deal with the atrocities of that war. The war was sober, and sheer numbers are showing that. 10 million people died, 21 million men were wounded, and left millions of widows, orphans, and grieving relatives behind. On the basis of this, every nation, in particular these of the Entente, draw their own conclusions, with similarities and differences between them. I will start with the similarities. One point which everybody could agree on was the honoring of the dead, which for example showed through the victory parades all over the world. This entails a special responsibility towards the dead that every country wanted to convert differently. Woodrow Wilson interpreted this responsibility that something like that wouldn't happen again. In order to obtain that goal, he proposed different mechanisms and ideas, which Yuri and Ms. Lopez also told you something about. I think it's important to understand that this wasn't an American movement in particular. No against war, independence, or no segregation movements showed the ambitions for political change. France, and especially people who had lost their relatives in the war, sought for something different. George Clemenceau knew that his country seek for revenge, not only because of the dead, also for the past, which was burdened through the French-German War in 1871 and the foundation of the German Empire in Versailles. Another big aspect of France's aims for the peace conference was the establishment of security, that could, in the opinion of France, only be accomplished and keep Germany down and or rather small. Many of the articles in the Treaty of Versailles are pointing to this position, like the payment of reparations, the maximum of 100,000 German soldiers, etc. This clashing interests and mindsets, on the one hand the commitment for a better world, and on the other hand the search for revenge and especially justice, showing the problems of the peace conference and the different goals of the parties. I didn't mention the goals of Great Britain because I think it is important to understand the opposite mindsets after the First World War. And the goal of Great Britain was always the stability on the European continent.
The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty signed on June 28, 1919 by the Big Three, as an end to the First World War. It was partly a result from the 14 points of Wilson and the ideas of the victims of the war, Great Britain and France. According to Wilson's 14 points, the treaty will provide a long-lasting peace and will prevent a new war. But, as we all know, the Second World War was lurking. How is it possible that the Treaty of Versailles based on Wilson's 14 points didn't work? For that answer, we have to look at the treaty, a few differences between the treaty and Wilson's 14 points. First, we'll look at the reduction of armaments. Wilson states that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. This is a bit of an ambitious statement, because it seems that all countries have to reduce their armaments, according to the arms race before the First World War. Instead, Germany is the only one who loses many armaments. Second, throughout the whole speech of Wilson, Russia and its people are very important. There is no confusion of counsel among the adversaries of the Central Powers, Wilson states. But where is Russia in the conference of the Treaty of Versailles? Third, one of Wilson's most important ideas is the realization of a general association of nations. In the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations is formed. However, Wilson said in his speech, "We stand together till the end. The US doesn't ratify the League." Next to that, Wilson demands sovereignty for many states. He wanted decolonization and evacuation of several states in Europe. Finally, the principle of justice is outlined throughout the whole program of Wilson. "Unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us," is still today an important quote of Wilson's speech. But is this quote actually reflected in the Treaty of Versailles? Are Germans' guilt and its unfair treatment justice? All these decisions in the Treaty of Versailles made the intended peace of Wilson less and less possible. This is a quote from Wilson's speech. "Principle of justice to all peoples and nationalities, and their right to live on equal terms of liberty and safety with one another, whether they be strong or weak." It is important to think about the interpretation of this quote. You may think that Wilson really means all people and every nationality. But President Wilson was also known for overseeing unprecedented segregation in federal offices and throwing the civil rights leader out of the Oval Office at the beginning of the First World War. So, what do you think? Are the 14 points guaranteed to everyone or just a small group of people and nationalities?